morning, everybody, and thanks for that introduction, Dom. It's always funny when you hear introductions, what they are, but I think I'm going to lead with former international football star from now on. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining this morning. It's been really a huge pleasure to spend time with you all yesterday and this evening, and my talk this morning is called Placing Audience at the Centre of Decolonisation, Reflections on Identity and Cultural Value in a National Cultural Institution. But actually, on reading it this morning, I think it should be called just Reflections of a Museum Director Trying to Move Forward, because really that's what it is. So it's going to be a little bit like what I hope those bedtime stories on the BBC are like in the evening, but in the morning for you all, to just ease you gently into your day. So nothing too severe. But I suppose, to start off, I just really would like to thank all the previous speakers yesterday for their incredibly interesting talks. I'd also like to thank Dom and Emma and Bryan for the invitation to speak today. Many of the key themes in museum practice that were touched on by a variety of speakers featured in my talk this morning. And it was that lovely moment, and I know everybody in this room is familiar with that, where you're sitting watching people speak and you're giving a talk the next day and you're wondering how much of your paper you're going to change, but actually there wasn't that much, so that was a bit of a relief. But it was also because I think there was just so many threads reflected through what people were saying. So really, my talk today is an invitation. I'm really interested in exploring a number of ideas and strategies in relation to the discourse on the decolonisation of museums, and how sometimes these actions are occasionally mobilised to reinforce more contemporary practice, which seeks to reorientate our museums towards greater relevance, inclusivity and democratisation. And this morning, I'd like to get your insight and your feedback into this. And my interest is driven in part by the audience attending today, and the opportunity that presents by a room of experts in both academia and museum practice. But what I hope is that this talk might suggest some opportunities for greater research and practice collaborations. I think this is an audience that could lead to that. And I also launch it with the caveat that some of my ideas today are by no means fully formed, and they come to you as a work in progress. So I'm interested in dialogue, and I welcome, that this work isn't easy and shouldn't be tokenistic. So let's start with the question. So the question that I want to propose is of who is asking us to do this work? Let's think about that for a moment. Laura, the director of the museum who chaired a brilliant panel yesterday, she makes reference to this in a recent discussion as part of a conference on settler colonialism, slavery, and the problem of decolonising museums. And when I read it, it really resonated with me. I think it's a really important question for museums to ask, and I hope that I can kind of address here a bit why I think that. I think it's an important question because I think it gets to the heart of the motivations of an organisation, and to the extent to which decolonising the museum is used as a metaphor. And just as an aside, I think Alistair mentioned this paper yesterday. This, and if I'm sure most of you have read it, but if you haven't, I'd encourage you to read it. To that extent to which decolonising the museum is used as a metaphor to maybe sometimes encompass multiple actions that are associated with human rights, social justice, and community engagement work, or a knee-jerk reaction to wider media coverage, thereby maybe placing this work in the context of Hannah mentioned this yesterday, virtue signalling or tokenistic gestures. So who is asking us to do this work, I think, forces us to consider if the impetus stems from a recognition of the unequitable and the racist systems and structures that exist in our organisations, and then a desire to challenge and change those structures by developing more community-led practice initiatives. I think much of the media work, and everybody in this room is familiar with this, is focused on polarities, with headlines that at times place museums and galleries and cultural spaces on either side of a spectrum entrenched policies that seek to hold on to collections and displays, and those that wish to return objects and redress exhibit displays and interpretations. And sometimes, often, the decisions of museum boards are reported and sometimes actually weaponized, I think is a fair word to use in this context, by opposite sides of a political spectrum, particularly with the media. And I just did a quick bring this of the report. Now, you know, obviously British Museum is a particular case in point, but this is the same story reported by the Daily Mail and by the Guardian. So if you just quickly look at those two headlines. And you can, I can put the references in, but you can read them. So I think, you know, sometimes this has propelled museums and cultural places into the front line of that term, the culture wars. But as museum practitioners, I think in the most part, we know that the work is more complex. We know that there's more listening, discussions, and debate to be had, and that there is no neat and speedy solution or path to innocence here, however much some within our organisations may wish that there was. And that's a kind of recognition of the pressures that happen across staff, curatorial, education, leadership within museums. So we know that there are a variety of actions that sit across this polarised spectrum. The return of artefacts to a community of origin, I don't think does not make a museum immediately anti-racist. And it is important, and in many cases a vital act of decolonial practice, but it does not dismantle the legacy of colonial structures that have perpetuated in our institutions. Within our own institution, the National Museum of Ireland, we're often very quick to point out that in the 1990s we repatriated two Toimoko to Te Papa. And while this was an incredibly important act, it did not lead to systematic change in our organisation. It did not lead to increased resources to enable more objects to be accessed and researched and returned to communities of origin. So most are notoriously under-resourced, and we seek to do the important work of care of collections while also ensuring that we interpret and mobilise these collections in contemporary and novel ways, that we reach a wide spectrum of audiences. Over the last 30 years in particular, there's been a growing emphasis on the question of the relevance of museums. How are we engaging with our audiences, reflecting their identity and lived experience? And part of this is recognising, as Wayne Modeste points out in a paper, that we're not just buildings that are dedicated to beautiful things that are neutral and non-political, and accepting that we operate in a wider social and political construct that has a role in reflecting the multiple identities of the audiences we serve. CEOs and directors of museums want to ensure that their museum reflects contemporary practice. We engage with our peers, we listen to new approaches in museum practice, we produce strategy, we plan, and we try to move forward. And in this process, on reflection, and I've done it myself as well, I'd argue that we often overlook the complex, seeking to reduce it to a pithy metaphor, such as the decolonisation of the museum. Because I think we see parallels between, and in respects, we see parallels between the work of greater community engagement with underrepresented audiences and repatriation of objects to communities of origin, and we seek to address them under one broad process. And I suppose my talk today is maybe just a reflection on this, and to take a moment and perhaps maybe caution against the desire to tackle many problems under one banner. So I feel we need to ask questions now. Who is asking us to do this work, and what is this work? And I think these questions should orientate us outwards. So they should orientate us away from the often all-encompassing ego of our museums, and to away from that polarity of the media, and actually to the people that we serve, and hopefully drive us away from the loudest voices in the room to what is actually needed. So just to be specific, I'm not suggesting that repatriation is not important, and I'm not suggesting that terms like decolonisation should be scrapped, or that new exhibition development within world culture collections in collaboration with underrepresented local communities is not worthwhile and incredibly important work in the context of becoming anti-racist institutions. But what I am saying is that maybe we should be careful not to see one approach as a solution to multiple historical wrongs or problems in our institutions. And I actually think Hannah illustrated this really beautifully in her talk yesterday, with real sincerity, I felt, about what has been achieved here in National Museums Northern Ireland and what still has to be done, needed and further explored. And I think that was kind of illustrated when she was speaking about the Multicultural Centre, and you could see, you wanted to reach out to her because you could see how much that was impacting her because of the sincerity of that work. So, in effect, I'm arguing that what we should do is situate our approaches in the context of our audiences, our wider global communities and our collections. We should carry out public consultation to understand better what our wider audience's understanding of this work is, and furthermore, what they feel about the work of addressing colonial legacies and questions of empire in our institutions. So, you might caution and say that depending on the process of consultation and the prevailing politics of a region, this could backfire and then drive us towards a more polarised approach. And here I would say this, and this is where I'd like to make the case for the relevance of museums in uncertain times that we live in now. Museums are not neutral. We operate within the social and political realms in which we sit, and there's been much debate about museums as activists, but in this context, I'd like to think of the values of our organisations, which are wide and varied, but I think can be addressed maybe in this context by a quote from Words Matter, from Wayne Modeste, which is, because museums do have a role to play in the public domain, in shaping how we see the world and interpret what is happening around us. Museums are visited by literally millions of people who may be challenged to reflect on our history and to think about our future. They have knowledge and experience that, when shared with others, can contribute to making that future for all. And so, this is the work that brought me into this sector. You heard a little bit about what Dom was saying early on, in that I fundamentally believe that that moment of connection between a visitor and an object or a work in arts or culture, that arts and cultural practice has a role in both challenging and including at the same time. And at our very best, our spaces can be places that, with the right people and processes and support, can produce work from our collections that challenge legacies and ways of seeing and learning that stem from these structures of colonialism. So museums and cultural institutions should be platforms for the diversity of communities we serve, because as publicly funded institutions, in a lot of our cases, it's our duty to ensure that we work and curate programmes that respond to the lived experience of our visitors and audience and challenge oversimplistic interpretations of history. We should, as Laura mentioned yesterday when she was chairing the panel, be proponents of the pluriverse, reflecting the multiple ways of seeing and learning in our world. And as an aside, I had a really interesting conversation with some people the other day about fairies and folklife and beliefs to do with our folklife collection. And I think that was just for me an example of reflecting that pluriverse sometimes in what we exhibit and how we exhibit. And this is not something that's nice to do, but it's actually, in Ireland, it's covered specifically by IMEC legislation, and I know some people mentioned, I think Hannah actually mentioned similar legislation in terms of the roles that we have as public bodies. But I think to do this, we need to understand the positions of our audiences as well as decolonial theory, and we need to reflect on how that informs and sits with the history of our organisations. In cases of the museum, like the National Museum of Ireland, that were established in the late 19th century, we live with the legacy of those structures that perpetuate a very particular Eurocentric white male view that underlines much of the ways we work. And this pervades all elements of our organisation, from how we describe an object in our collection database to how we curate and exhibit and how we are governed. Audrey talked a bit about this yesterday, but obviously Free State when we were still part of the British Empire, and it's also during this period in the early 20th century that a number of the artefacts within what we still term our ethnographic collection came into the museum. In 1927, Niles Lithberg was commissioned by the emerging Free State to produce a report on how the National Museum of Ireland should be organised and established. And this process saw a shift in our acquisition policy and in turn our exhibition display. And so in the context of speakers yesterday, this is post-Plunkett from Pat's talk, and in most part after when most of the collection from what Rachel, Aoife and Gay spoke about came to the National Museum of Ireland. Lithberg proposed that the museum's collections should be on Irish archaeology and ethnological collections. And this also led to the initiation of the Irish Folklife collection, which then was interpreted as an extension of archaeology in which the material culture of rural life over the previous 200 years was connected with the material culture of Irish people from prehistory onward. These actions were seen at the time as attempts to decolonise Ireland by collecting and preserving the country's own material culture. Yet subsequently, in relation to our Folklife collection, this policy superimposed a sort of temporal bias on this collection. So we had an arbitrary end of 1950 to the Irish Folklife collection, effectively assumed that folklife was static from the point of kind of more pervasive mechanisation. And so decades of collecting were missed within the museum in some respects, not all respects. I often think, and Audrey and me talk about, our collecting gaps often reveal more about prevailing politics than what we actually did collect. This has recently been changed through a revision of our Irish Folklife acquisition strategy, which includes two new elements. One, and expanding the voices in collecting, and I'll just kind of cover that. So expanding involves response to the considerable discussion within the museum community about the representation of diverse populations in collections, and whether the people who typically make acquisition decisions adequately speak for all of society. Three factors have prompted this interest: concerns that collections do not adequately reflect minority communities, all socioeconomic groups, underrepresentation of particular ethnic groups, and also a desire to increase engagement with the National Museum and its collections by those groups who have felt most excluded in the past. And given that the Folklife collection is a collection of the everyday, we've also included in our acquisitions policy the facilitation of a national appeal. So once every 5 years, where people in Ireland and the diaspora will be asked to nominate what they believe to be most representative object or group of objects of everyday life. So just returning to considering the history of the National Museum in the context of today's conversations on decolonial culture. The historic action of the emerging Irish Free State demonstrates the recognition that people in positions of power had of the role of museums in establishing a specific narrative that supported and legitimised the Free State and its structures. And what I would also say is this isn't necessarily finished. At the moment, within the National Museum of Ireland, we're producing our 20th Century History of Ireland exhibition, and we're grappling with questions of nation and identity and state. And you know, throughout Europe, you're seeing many museums that are exploring contemporary history and identity. And so this is a very real and prescient discussion that we're all having. So therefore, while the history of the National Museum of Ireland and being formed under empire and then evolving as a reflection of the emerging identity of a free state and republic makes us unique to some of our European counterparts, it does not leave us innocent of colonial power structures and collections. These remain and require our sensitive consideration. These need particular consideration when we think of contemporary Ireland and the many marginalised communities that have been excluded from the narrative of our recent contemporary history in the last 120 years. In 2018, the National Museum of Ireland, and this is what this slide is about, opened an exhibition, A Traveller's Journey, in our Museum of Country Life in Mayo, and this resulted in a long process of relationship building with the traveller community by our Folklife curator, Rosa Meehan, and it revealed the degree to which the museum had historically failed to address traveller culture and heritage in its collections, and it led to a new project which is funded by the Department of Children, Equality, Inclusion and Youth, and that of a Traveller Culture Collections Development Officer, Owen de Vardoon, who took up his role this year, and he's going to spend the coming months engaging in consultation with the wider traveller community to understand better how they would like their culture and heritage represented in the museum and develop the structure of how we do that work. But I suppose furthermore, the legacy of that refocus on Irish archaeology and folklife and the formation of the Irish Free State led to a lack of resources and curatorial expertise on our ethnographic collections, which we're only now getting an opportunity to address. And Aoife and Rachel and Gay all addressed this in their talks yesterday, but that had really significant implications for communities of origin and researchers that sought to gain information and access to these collections. While to enable that access in as much as possible, it's been impacted hugely by a lack of dedicated resources, no publicly accessible database of what we hold in these collections. But I'm happy to say that we are in a process of recruitment for a curator and ethnographer in this role, and we look forward to upcoming publications by Rachel, the work that Aoife was speaking about, and as well completion of our publicly accessible database, which will allow that wider dissemination. In preparation for this paper, I sought out projects and research that had engaged wider consultation and audience engagement on the questions of repatriation and decolonisation. But to be honest, I struggled to find many. I was really excited to see the work that Laura drew attention to yesterday at Pitt Rivers, where they put some questions into their STAC questionnaire, the sort of omnibus questionnaires that go out, and we've one of those as well. I was really interested in how they really thought long and hard about framing that question. One other project that I'm aware of as well is this one that's happening at the moment in museums, galleries in Scotland that I think is worth noting. And as part of that, they're also carrying out a national consultation to establish public and expert perspectives on how museums can contribute to our understanding of the legacies of slavery, empire and colonialism. And as a result of this project, and based on the evidence gathered, the steering group will make a set of recommendations to the Scottish Government in 2022. In developing the recommendations, the steering group will look broadly at potential mechanisms for addressing the legacies of slavery, empire and colonialism in museum spaces through collections. So a lot of principles around decolonising the museum have been published in the literature around arts, culture and museum practice. And I suppose I'd kind of finish by bringing this piece. I wonder about language and how we use the word decolonisation. Laura made some point around this yesterday as well in relation to museums, and if we should move towards advocating for anti-racist practice and organisations, and should we consider how the words we use are understood outside of our immediate museum practice and academic settings. And then I also think it's time for action. It's enough consent, and it's time to try really hard, perhaps listen, be open, collaborate, be inclusive, engage, try harder, don't judge, be self-aware, and fundamentally somewhere through that process try to bring our audiences with us. At the National Museum of Ireland, we are both at the beginning of that journey and centuries into it, and we move forward with creating new roles and bringing resources to bear on collections that have at best sat silent and not had their full story told, or at worst been misinterpreted. And we're working on foraging relationships and with underrepresented communities to our museum, and territorial divisions and structures and what we include and what we exclude. I'm beginning to make progress with publications and databases to make our collections more publicly accessible. I do hope that when we all meet again, we'll have taken more action. But for now, I'd like you to join me in reflection, in input, suggestion, in critiques, in those wonderful critical friends approaches and ideas for research. I've already cooked up a plan with Elizabeth for our natural history collections, which is a major capital project that we're working on at the moment. But I know that there are more ideas to be shared, to be understood, and so this is the opportunity of going over to all of you. Thank you.